listening to the radio and watching on television, as we return to a story we just recently covered, Iraq's missing billions. Just weeks after the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration began airlifting plane loads of cash to Baghdad for use by U.S. occupation officials. $12 billion in U.S. currency was shipped in just over a year. But where did the money go? To date, at least $9 billion cannot be accounted for. Last month, Democracy Now! Interviewed the investigative journalist team, Donald Barlett and James Steele. They published a shocking expose in Vanity Fair tracking how the money went from the Federal Reserve to Iraq. Well, 2 weeks later, the former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan appeared on Democracy Now! For a debate with the journalist Naomi Klein. In our interview, I asked Alan Greenspan about Barlett and Steele's piece. I wanted to ask you about, well, a piece by Jim Steele and Don Bartlett that came out in Vanity Fair, where they're talking about the billions lost in Iraq. And they begin their piece by saying between April 2003 and June 2004 in U.S. currency, much of it belonging to the Iraqi people, was shipped from the Federal Reserve to Baghdad, where it was dispensed by the Coalition Provisional Authority. Some of the cash went to pay for projects and keep ministries afloat, but incredibly, at least $9 billion has gone missing, unaccounted for, in a frenzy of mismanagement and greed. Alan Greenspan, when you were head of the Federal Reserve, how much knowledge do you have of this, and did you investigate this? Were you aware of this at the time?
Well, let me say that what we were involved in was essentially endeavoring to create a viable currency for the Central Bank of Iraq. And what we did do was, I think very successfully, create what is a viable financial system even under the circumstances that currently exist. There was, as far as I can judge, a huge drain of the resources into areas which nobody to this day can understand or follow. It had nothing to do with the central bank and in our relationships with them. We were merely acting as an intermediary to assist them in creating a system which they now have, which is working reasonably well, despite all of the problems that are going on. The issue which you're referring to had nothing to do with the Federal Reserve in any of our relationships with the central bank.
Well, they're talking about, in one day, for example, the East Rutherford Operations Center of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 100 Orchard Street in East Rutherford, a tractor-trailer truck pulling up. And though accustomed to receiving and shipping large quantities of cash, the vault had never before processed a single order of this magnitude, $2.4 billion in $100 bills. But ultimately, again, $9 billion of $12 billion gone missing in Iraq.
I am not familiar with any such evidence, and it's certainly not brought to my attention. I frankly find it very unlikely that those orders of magnitude were involved in any of the numbers that we were dealing with. You have to make certain that there's been a lot of confusion about losses, and people have used the dinar, the basic currency unit of Iraq, and assumed they were American dollars, and of course that gives you a highly distorted view. I've seen several reports fairly recently in which that sort of mistake was being made.
Well, this
but all I can tell you is that no such numbers of any order of magnitude of the type you are discussing came to the attention of the Federal Reserve.
This is based on that award-winning article in Vanity Fair, or the team who have won.
Award-winning doesn't necessarily.
Well, I mean Jim Bartlett and Don Bartlett and Jim Steele, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. I'm sure you know their work. But Naomi Klein?
Well, I would just add that it's quite surprising, actually, that Mr. Greenspan is unaware of the scandal around Iraq's missing billions, because Paul Bremer had to testify before Congress and was asked directly about those missing billions. It's been the subject of very high-level investigations. There's a huge paper trail around it, so this is hardly a secret, and it's hardly just a matter that's confined to Vanity Fair. This is...
Well, I'm not saying that the losses are not real. I think they are, because obviously we can't account for all the oil revenues. I'm just merely saying it's not something which was directly related to any of the actions which the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, to which you're referring, was involved, as far as I know.
That was the former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan speaking on Democracy Now! Last month. For response, we are joined by that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalistic team, the authors of the Vanity Fair piece, Don Barlett and Jim Steele, two of the nation's top investigative journalists, joining us from Philadelphia, where they live. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jim and Don. Don, why don't you begin your response to the former head of the Fed, Alan Greenspan?
Good to be with you, Amy. One of the problems is that Mr. Greenspan speaks in a language that is unknown to most of us. He's done this for years in a kind of economic doublespeak, which goes unchallenged. But in this particular case, Mr. Greenspan is flat wrong. Jim obtained a lot of this information, which came from Mr. Greenspan's Federal Reserve Bank.
I mean, one of the things it's hard to decide where almost to begin to talk about this comment of his. He talks about confusion. One of the most significant things that's part of this whole process, the fact that they don't know where this came from, where these numbers came from. All of these numbers from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is if not a branch, it's certainly a part of the Federal Reserve System, which Chairman Greenspan headed for so long. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York provided these to various U.S. government agencies, various congressional committees. There are literally thousands of pages of documents that led to the statistics that we used in our article, which was that basically 12 billion was shipped in this 14-month period. And on the one day in particular, you mentioned the 2.4 billion. All of that is out of records of the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System certainly was intimately involved in processing this cash from the very beginning. Once it got to Iraq, which is the point we made in our story, that's where everything vanished, where there was absolutely no oversight, where there was no follow-up, and the idea that this went into creating a viable system over there is almost comical, because when you look at some of the records in Iraq, you see that much of this money went to the Ministry of Finance, which in turn turned this over to various Iraqi banks. But exactly where it went from there, nobody to this day knows.
And Jim, is it conceivable to you that Chairman Greenspan would not know about the $2.4 billion that on that particular day and the inability to track it afterwards?
We're speculating on this, but just based on what he said, it sounds to us that he did not know about this. And but again, as I think Naomi made the point earlier, and we certainly made it in the article, this is not exactly a secret. There's a substantial amount of documentation out there about those transfers. They're listed by day, and that's why we were able to make the statement of the 2.4 billion transfer on that June day back in 2004. That was the largest single transfer of currency in the history of the New York Fed, and indeed in the history of any branch of the Federal Reserve. So, how
could Alan Greenspan, who at the time was the head of the Federal Reserve, not know about this transfer?
Your guess is as good as ours on this one.
But I think an even bigger issue here, Amy, is that Alan Greenspan always speaks with great authority, often on areas and subjects he really doesn't have much knowledge in, but yet he has never, ever, when he was head of the Federal Reserve, was very seldom challenged. And this is one case in which he's put his foot in his mouth, because the Federal Reserve did indeed do all of the things that were attributed to them in the article. And there's nothing, as Jim indicated, there's a record of this. And there were also, I mean, there were a lot of emails back and forth between the Federal Reserve and the various agencies of the U.S. government. So the record is voluminous here, and for Mr. Greenspan to suggest it's something that we're confusing dinars and dollars is really disingenuous.
And